Continuing into the eye area or ocular region, the first thing I want to do is smooth out some of that simplified planar definition that we have left over from the early stages of blocking out. I'm going to hold Shift and lightly touch on all of these areas, including the eye bulge and the brow, because the brow especially has a straight horizontal form that's left over, and where the brow actually, raises up in the middle. So I'm going to pull the brow upward in the middle, giving it more of an arch. All right, this is the superciliary arch. However, I do not want to bring up the eye bulge with it. I want to leave that down. So with a smaller brush size, let's make sure that that's left down. And then the eye bulge in general towards the outside is kind of slanting upward. So I'm going to move that down to better neutralize it. Everything looks pretty smooth. And by smoothing it, we transition from that planar structure into the organic side. And something I like to do sometimes is better contextualize this eye bulge with my crease brush, simply cutting in a slit that represents where the upper and lower eyelid meet whenever the eyes are closed. So now it looks like our eyes are closed, and seeing that within context rather than that simplified planar geometry, which looks so unnatural next to our organic nose and mouth, seeing this within better context can help reveal some things that we need to adjust, like particularly the inside corner of the eye, in between the caruncle and the bridge of the nose. This area needs to be pushed inward. This actually sits quite deep, and right now it's more shallow. So let's, with the inflate brush, I'm going to hold Control and just push this inward. I have a fairly subtle strength at 0.3, so I don't want to go too far or too fast. But yeah, push that in, kind of smooth it out. And this sets us up better when we start sculpting the actual eye anatomy, meaning that we will be sculpting this eye open. Just seeing it in context with the eye closed is a temporary measure. So I will fill in that shape now with the fill brush, so it returns back to just being a bulge. And this kind of turns it into a canvas that I can mask off the almond shape of an open eye. But before we do that, I want to jump over to object mode and add a separate piece of geometry for the eyeball. So let's hit Shift A, Mesh, UV Sphere. And the reason I want a separate object is that maintaining a spherical shape within the original sculpture is going to be way too difficult, and it's never going to be perfect. You'll always be fighting that inside of the eye that's supposed to be so spherical. So it's way easier to just create a separate piece of geometry, at which point the battle is placing it correctly, which is what we want to do here. So the reason I like a UV sphere is that it has poles on either end, and you can imagine that this inner circle is going to be the pupil, and the one outside of it is going to be the iris. So we can tab into edit mode, rotate in X 90 degrees. Now it's facing forward as an eyeball would. We just need to set up the position and the scale. So the first step of establishing a scale, you'll often hear an eyeball size compared to a golf ball or even a ping pong ball. And I'm assuming that you have held one of the two of those. And you can imagine how big that is in your hand. Then imagine your hand size next to your face, and then apply that on screen. You should be able to get the eye within the ballpark. Okay, so that's about the size of a golf ball. So that's stage one. Stage two, I like to compare it to the chin. So I'm going to move that down here, specifically in between the bottom edge of the chin and the labiomental sulcus. I'm pretty close, but I'll scale it down just a little bit more. There we go. That fits a little bit better. And then the third measurement I like to make is how it fits within the tip of the nose, specifically the horizontal edges of the nostrils, where the philtrum connects to the nose, as well as the lateral septal cartilage transitions over to the major alar cartilage. And once we compare our eyeball size to those three things, we should be really close to an accurate eyeball size. And from here, I will position it behind our eye bulge. All right, so I want it to fit within. And keep in mind, it's important to have a slight slant at the front of the eyeball, like this. Not straight up and down. And actually, this slant is probably a little too extreme. Something more in the middle like that. So with that in mind, I think actually I will adjust the geometry real quick, jump over to sculpt mode with my grab brush. Let's bring the bottom of it out a little bit. So it's still slanted, but just not as slanted. And then back to object mode, make sure that our sphere, which we should rename to eyeball, or just eyes, keep it simple, is going to be positioned properly. Let's hide our annotations for the moment. There we go. So now our eye sits inside of the bulge, and that should be good positioning, at least initially. Now, I fully expect to have to move this around in the near future, but for now, that's looking pretty good. It's actually looking a little too close to the nose when I look at front orthographic view. So let's move it back towards the center. All right, I'm going to be okay with it intersecting the eyeball bulge, because ultimately the bulge should adhere to the sphere, not the sphere to the bulge entirely. So this tells me that the outside edge of the bulge, if we switch back to sculpt mode, should actually come out a bit. And the last thing I want to do to the eyeball geometry is give it a mirror modifier. So we'll select it, add modifier mirror, and for mirror object, we'll eyedrop select our head sculpture. There we go. Look from the front. I think the eyeball positioning looks pretty good. And we're ready to extract that almond shape. All right, so we're transitioning from theoretical eye closed to now we will be opening the eye. I'm going to switch to my head in sculpt mode, and I want to draw a mask of that almond shape. However, before I can draw a mask, I need to make sure that all my geometry in this region is high enough to accommodate a fairly detailed mask. So I've got dynamic topology still set to 7. With my simplify brush, I'll make strokes along the surface to update that geometry. If we switch to wireframe mode, you can see that that geometry is updated. And now I'm ready to switch to the mask brush with the M hotkey. And let's draw our almond shape. Now I'm going to use the bottom edge as a template. All right, so we're going to draw right along that curve and then kind of split the upper side in half. All right, so I'm not going to come all the way to the top, but rather split it in half to create my almond shape. And then for the upper left corner of the almond, I find that this is a steeper incline, and then it gradually smooths back out like this. Although I made everything a little bit too big with that. The bottom side is fairly symmetrical, but the top side I find is asymmetrical. All right, we'll come down to a nice point. Zoom out, see how that looks. I actually think I'm still a little too far outward. There we go. And then the last thing is simply to add a caruncle shape to the inside. All right, now this doesn't have to be a perfect shape. We just need to get something started that we can manipulate to be perfect later. With that established, Control I to invert, and we will use our transform tool. Set the pivot in the sculpt menu to unmasked. And I'm going to move this backward. All right, so I want it to go further than our eyeball. All right, Alt M. Well, before we clear the mask, let's just turn off overlays. And now we can get an idea of how our eyeball is sitting inside the eyeball mesh. Switch to our grab brush. And let's see here. I think that my eyeball geometry is actually a little too far outside. You can see that the thickness of the preliminary eyelids is much thicker than the outside, suggesting that the eyeball is not centered. There we go, just a little shift that way. All right, that looks pretty good. It also says that the inside, I was correct in my hunch earlier that we should bring that inward because we're way too far from the spherical eye. So let's lock the Z-axis and X-axis actually, so that we maintain the shape from the front, but we move it backward only. Oh wait, I'm still masked. Alt-M to clear the mask, and then I'll be able to move that backward. There we go. So roughly getting the thickness of our eyelid consistent all the way around, and we are well on our way to sculpting the eye. And at this point, we've done the simple part, but we're still far from being realistic in terms of anatomy. So it's a good idea to jump over to our anatomical model and frame our understanding so we can continue sculpting properly. If we think about what we've sculpted so far, the mouth and the nose, you'll remember that we haven't really looked at the skeletal layer of anatomy. And that's because the bone structure plays little role in the external shape of the mouth, lips, and nose, or nostrils especially. In the case of the nose, it's all cartilage and fat. And in the case of the mouth, it's more muscles and fat. And whenever I'm analyzing anatomy, as a modeler, I really only care what that internal anatomy does to the outside appearance. And so when it comes to the eye, you can see that there's a clear rim surrounding the eye. And this is the rim of the skull. So for the eye, we do need to mind 3 layers: skeletal, muscular, and fat. And while there are some intricacies around this skeletal orbital rim, the most noticeable landmarks from the outside are going to be the superciliary arch, supraorbital margin, the zygomatic bone, which forms the cheekbone as it swoops around the bottom left side of the eye, and then the frontal process, which helps form the infraorbital margin. But in basic terms, this is a structural loop that surrounds the eye. And then when we switch over to the muscular side, there's one main muscle, the orbicularis oculi, and this is a loop muscle that, if we close the eyes, simply has a slit in it that is able to open and close, forming the upper and lower eyelid. Now, from an external standpoint as a modeler, this doesn't really explain or clarify what's going on with the eye shape. It looks kind of the same as it does from the outside. However, whenever we open the eye, there is a distinct characteristic of a flesh overhang on the upper outside of the eye. And the muscle doesn't really inform that. It's because on the fat layer, the superior orbital fat is what occupies that space. And whenever the eye is opened, that flesh kind of bulges out and overhangs. But when the eye is closed, this whole area stretches out and becomes smooth. It's also good to be mindful that the inferior orbital fat plumps up the area below the lower eyelid. But really, the key feature up here is the superior orbital fat. And so with this in mind, let's jump back over to our sculpture and implement these structures. Let's start by cutting in the palpebral folds, which is the crease that forms above and below the eyelids. Okay, so we'll grab, let's see, our draw sharp brush first. And on the top, we've already got that kind of formed naturally, left over from the simplified blockout. I'm just going to push that in now, holding Control. We're following parallel to the eyelid itself, then really continuing to just outline the caruncle as well. And then the lower eyelid, all holding Control. Now with the lower eyelid, we're going to dip lower in the middle and then come back closer to the eyelid as we reach the ends. So rather than being an even distance from the lower eyelid, we're going to dip lower in the middle. But on the upper eyelid, we will maintain a consistent distance as we push in. And this is another example where I don't want to be too subtle with this push in, especially on the top. We can be a little more subtle on the bottom, but I don't want to be too subtle on the top. We want that to be pushed in significantly, probably twice as much as the lower. There we go. And once we've got that started, remember the draw sharp brush does not generate new geometry, so I'm going to use my crease brush instead with the Shift-C hotkey to, it's acting kind of funny, I think because, oh, I still have lock on in Z and X. Okay, so let's turn off any locks, and now the crease brush should tighten these creases and update their geometry. It's especially important on the top, not so much on the bottom. Okay, so we will tighten it further with the pinch brush. Kind of polish this off into a nice tight crease. And then on the inside, I'm going to use my inflate brush again to push this inward. All right, only on the inside. We're not going to do the same thing around the eye. There needs to be a depth here because there's a distinct shadowing that happens in this region once there's lighting involved. So it definitely needs to be deeper there. That's looking pretty good. Now at the base of the caruncle, I'm actually going to smooth this out and kind of flatten it a bit. All right, so that it's deepest as we approach the upper side of the eyelid. And then on the bottom, let's see, I actually want to, right now it sort of looks like a wrinkle rather than an indentation. So I want to use the Draw Sharp brush with a large fall off, hold Control and push this inward. Okay, so now we have a valley instead of just a wrinkle. So by wrinkle, what I mean, a wrinkle, if the surface is flat like this, where are my annotations? If the surface is flat like this, a wrinkle can exist in that surface and be noticeable, but the surface does not actually change direction. Whereas what I want this to do is change direction like this. So that's what the Draw Sharp at a large fall off will do for me. Then I can pinch it nice and tight. And some people have this defined so clearly, but others have it smoothed out more. So I'll smooth it out just a little bit. There we go, that's pretty believable. Smooth outside of that crease. Okay, and so whenever we're forming these shapes from a certain angle, it can look good from that angle. It's very important to look at it from all angles. As we look at it from below, we can see just how uneven this crease is. So I want to pull this out so that the contour is very smooth. And once it looks good from the front and from below or from above, that's how we know our shape is accomplished. So that looks much better on the inferior palpebral sulcus. On the top, let's do the same thing. So we can see that the lid is a bit uneven in terms of thickness. We also need to update the lid with geometry. So let's take our inflate brush, just lightly plump it up a little bit, mostly to update the geometry. And when we smooth it with Shift, it will be updated and can accommodate further sculpting. All right, it's still pretty lumpy. So this is going to be a battle when it comes to the eyelids, is dealing with the lumpiness. But what can help is to use the scrape brush to really flatten out the inside edge of our eyelids. And that will leave us with a nice hard edge, which is actually common in eyelid anatomy. But we'll take the approach that we've been using of going too far or too defined and then smoothing it out. That looks pretty good. A problem that we're running into is that the eyelid profile looks good from this angle, but when we look up here, the eyelid angle is far too steep as it approaches the eyeball. So we want to actually lift this up on its interior edge. And that can be a little bit tricky to do. Let's try it with the grab brush. Actually, yeah, that's probably going to be our best bet. There we go. And then smooth out what's left. Now this is a job for the clay strips brush. So on the upper eyelid, as it approaches the outside, it's going to overlap the lower eyelid. So we'll take our clay strips and make a bunch of strokes to create the overlap. It most certainly does not just continue with an even thickness all the way around the eye. That's something I see a lot of new sculptors do, and that's just not correct. So make sure you do not do that. We want the overlap. I switch to my crease brush, and now I'm just re-emphasizing those shapes. We can use smooth, but also probably scrape to flatten out the upper eyelid. It's kind of lumpy right now. There we go. Scrape and smooth have done the job. Let's look at it from an extreme angle like this and see just how bad the wobbliness is. And we will even it up. I can't emphasize enough just how important it is to look at your sculpture from all angles, make sure it looks good from all angles. Trying to keep the contours of the eyelids very, very straight, very, very consistent. Smooth out the upper side because there's a ridge there that I don't want. And let's take a look at the caruncle. Right now it's got the right shape, but there's a lot of meat missing inside of it. So let's use our fill brush to fill inside. More fill towards the eyeball, less fill towards the outside edge. And we might need to use subdivide collapse for this because our geometry is getting pretty tight and artifacts are likely to appear. So once I've got it filled, actually that might be all I need to do. There we go. Then I can pull the inside towards the eyeball. It does tend to flatten out because this is like a membrane that also bulges a bit. So with my inflate, we'll bulge it out. Crease brush, we'll make sure that's a nice tight crease inside where the transition from skin to caruncle happens. Okay, I think that looks pretty good. You know, at the detailing stage, we'll come in and make the caruncle perfect, you know, fully detailed, but for now, this is gonna work well. It's a little bit too big, so let's make it come to more of a point. All right, I think that's believable. And at this point, let's add some temporary materials to our eyeball. Also smooth it because the faceting is not very helpful. So I'll right click, shade smooth, turn on our overlays so you can see what's selected. Get rid of our annotation layer and tab into edit mode. Remember, we want this inner circle to be a pupil. So let's create 3 different material slots. The second one, add a new material and we'll call it temp underscore eye iris. The third slot will add a new material, call it temp eye pupil. And let's assign this. Then with the iris material selected, select the next ring of edges, or faces really, and click assign there as well. Now we need to change their color, specifically the viewport display color. All right, so with the pupil selected, let's take that almost entirely to black. And then with the iris selected, we'll take that down to a dark gray. Okay. All right, so that's not nearly enough iris. I do tend to bevel this edge, Control B to spread it out a little bit, and make both of these edges the iris, just to increase the size a bit. And with the eyeball facing straight forward, remember it's moved upward a little bit in the socket. So I want to rotate this down. And this kind of reveals that our eyelids are opened a little bit too much. There's kind of like a surprised expression. So let's adjust the shape of our lids, essentially the shape of that almond mask that we made in the beginning. All right, generally, the iris is going to intersect with the upper and lower eyelid. Intersects more with the upper eyelid, a little less with the lower eyelid. So I like to make the lower eyelid just touch the edge of the iris, whereas the upper eyelid eclipses it, you know, significantly. All right, that's a little bit better. Still, there's a bit of a surprised expression. Also kind of a staring blankly expression, which says the eyes are a little bit too spread far apart in the way that they are oriented. So R for rotate in the Z axis. You know, this looks cross-eyed, obviously. So it's kind of finding the balance. I think that looks pretty good. Actually, no, it's a little too cross-eyed still. There we go. That's fairly natural. And still, I think I can just decrease the opening in our eye shape to get rid of some of that surprised, kind of wired feel to it. I don't want expression in a neutral sculpture or model. So I'm just going to bring in all of the edges of the eyelid. Make sure to maintain consistent thickness all the way around. There we go. That feels better. A little more neutral, a little more natural. Okay, I'm pretty happy with this so far. The last remaining piece of eyelid anatomy is that fleshy overhang. And the way I'm going to create this is with the mask brush. I'm going to mask a large outline above the upper eyelid. All right, we're going to make it encircle it completely, and on the lower half, it's going to have a very hard edge. So hold Control and make sure that I'm not masking any of the lid itself, but everything above the superior palpebral fold. Let's increase the size of the upper mask a little bit more, and then hold Shift to smooth just the upper half. We're going to leave that lower half nice and tight. Okay, Control I to invert, and we'll turn off our overlays. And I'll use a combination of G grab to first bring down the outside mass. Okay, so I'm pulling it down, and I'm going to stop. You know, it depends on the person. Some of these fleshy masses can extend closer to the inside of the eye, but the majority of the overhang tends to be on the outside. All right, so I've pulled it down, and I'm also going to plump it out with the inflate. We're going to have a nice, whoops, I'm using the wrong dynamic topology. Refine method, let's go back to subdivide edges. I'm going to inflate a tighter tube towards the inside of the eye. Let's just do the whole thing first. So a tight tube kind of around the overhang. Hopefully you see what I mean by tube. But then on the outside region, I want to plump that up to extend beyond just the tube. Okay. Now what might help here is to use the Draw Sharp brush, hold Control, and that's too strong. Shift F and make this lower strength, like 0.3, and we'll kind of draw an arc up towards the center and then down the center of the mass, like this. Okay? That shape right there is important. Then we'll smooth it out because we don't actually want there to be a really tight crease. There we go. That is so much more natural. It took me a long time to understand this shape, but once I did, all of my eyes just leveled up in terms of realism. So definitely mind that overhang. Do not neglect it. And so as we continue up, we're kind of into the brow, which does not have a lot of definition. So let's use my inflate brush to just lightly update the geometry. Is that happening? Oh, I must still be masked. Yeah, Alt-M to clear the mask. We'll try that again. Just lightly update the geometry, smooth it out. Same thing with the outside. Let's take a look at the shape of the brow from above. I feel like it's a little too heavy in the middle. So let's hit 7 on our number pad. Definitely towards the center, I want to bring that in. Towards the glabella. And then out here, let's kind of bring that out as well, give it a little more mass. There we go, it feels better to me. While we're on the brow, I'm going to go ahead and use the Draw Sharp brush to hint at an eyebrow. You know, we're not going to be sculpting actual hair in here. Let's undo that. I don't like the shape of that. Let's try this again. Eyebrows tend to start low and then raise up and then back down. That kind of thing. Although I think I went a little too far out. Let's try that a third time. Third time's a charm, right? So start low, come up, and then back down. And once I have a nice crisp edge, the next thing I like to do is use my inflate brush, make it a little bit bigger than our ridge, and hold Control. And so the idea here is that it's kind of inflating on either side of the ridge. All right, and then we'll smooth that all out because it's way too sharp. But the goal with that, in terms of profile, if I switch to a different matte cap, I don't want this kind of shape, but I want something more like that. So there's some plumpness on either side of the ridge. That's kind of what I'm after. Let's take a look at this with a better matcap. All right, that's a pretty good start. I'm going to go back to my Draw Sharp brush and cut in a diagonal rounded ridge, which will better establish the superciliary arch separation from the glabella. All right, so the glabella is this shape in the middle, superciliary arch hooks around there. So if you define this too much, it's going to look a little bit like they're mad, you know, like a furrowed brow. So we're just going to cut it in deep and then smooth it out. Also smooth out the eyebrow as it approaches the end of the superciliary arch. He's still got a little bit of anger in the brow, so we'll smooth that out a little bit more. Maybe bring it up too, not have it dip so far down. There we go, that's a little more neutral. And then perhaps the brow extends a little too far outward. That's not too bad. Maybe one of the last things I need to do is use the Draw Sharp and kind of continue where the crow's feet are. I'm going to cut an edge, a valley out towards the ear and then smooth it. I don't want that to be harsh, but I want it to be indented a little bit more. All right, let's take a look at our eye. And I'm pretty happy with that. You know, we could cut in the infraorbital rim a bit more, have it swoop back up to define the outside edge. Although the more you define this kind of thing, the older the person looks. But still, I recommend defining it and then smoothing it out, because most people do have some level of definition of these structures. There we go. That's pretty good.